We're going to begin tonight with a series of October surprises. One of them coming just this afternoon from the Biden administration, which has announced that the president is pardoning thousands of Americans who were convicted of possession of marijuana. And the White House is asking governors to do the same. This comes at a time when Democrats are eager to energize young voters just over 30 days before midterm election day. The other surprise, a decision by the group of oil-producing countries known as OPEC Plus that could end up hiking prices at the pump here at home. We're going to get to that in a moment. But first, to discuss both of these things, I want to bring in a couple of my CBS News colleagues, Steven Portnoy and Caitlin Huey-Burns. Steven is CBS News' radio White House correspondent, and Caitlin is a CBS News political correspondent. Welcome so much to you both. Caitlin, I'll start with you. Lay out for us what exactly it is that the president announced today when it comes to marijuana and who it's going to affect.
Yeah, Nancy, well, this is a pretty big decision coming from the White House today, and it basically does three things. First, the main component is that it pardons federal offenses of simple marijuana possession. It also urges governors to do the same, and that's significant because the White House says that the majority of marijuana offenses are at the state level. So you're seeing that urging there, and there are a handful of states where marijuana is not only illegal, but it's also criminalized, and it hasn't been decriminalized yet. And it is also ordering the Health and Human Services Department to essentially review the way that marijuana is classified. The Biden administration argued that it's essentially classified on the same level as heroin and less and stronger than fentanyl, which of course is a huge issue. So this kind of taken together, the timing is really interesting here, which we'll talk about in a moment, but who it stands to benefit. They say about 6,500 people will benefit from this, but it's important to note that no one is currently serving federal prison time for a simple marijuana sentence. So it's not going to all of a sudden release lots of people from jail. The main point of it, as you heard from Biden, was that it kind of removes these barriers for people when they're applying for jobs, trying to get housing, and other types of barriers in place. But the administration hailing this as a big deal.
Stephen, I think it's such an important point that Caitlin makes, which is that nobody is currently serving time in federal prison solely for federal marijuana possession. So it's not as if these pardons open the floodgates for people to be let out of prison. Nobody's going to get let out of prison at this moment because of this executive order. Yet it is still a big shift for this president.
It's a significant one, and I think the last point that Caitlin made in terms of what the president's going to be doing today is important. He's starting a conversation within the federal government of reclassifying marijuana. For decades, in contravention of public opinion in this country and the decisions of several states, marijuana has been classified as a Schedule I drug, which essentially says that there's no useful medical purpose. And we know so many states say that there is a medical use for marijuana. So the conversation is going to begin for the first time in decades. Advocates say it's long overdue. Most Americans would say it's long overdue. But importantly, politically, this is something now less than 5 weeks to go before the midterm elections. The president is going to be able to turn to young people in particular and say, this is something that I'm doing that you're concerned about. Despite the fact that for years, Joe Biden, as a senator and even as a candidate, was a bit reluctant to say that there should be a decriminalization. He most recently said in a campaign that he does not believe that people should go to prison for marijuana use, but he also believed that there should be some scientific conversation here about the impact of marijuana. And that's part of the review that HHS and the Department of Justice are going to be undertaking now.
And Caitlin, Stephen brought up young voters, and that is such a good point because recent polls have showed us that young voters are not necessarily all that fired up to vote in this midterm election. It's a big problem for Democrats. Is that what's behind the president's decision to announce this now?
Well, you can't help but look at the timeline of this. We're a month away from the midterm elections, where you note that there is a depressed base kind of across the board, and the White House has been looking for ways to tout accomplishments to appeal to that base. And a big target has been young voters who typically don't turn out in midterm election years the way that they would in general election years. And even in general election years, that number is quite low. And so this could be a way to help to rile them up, especially as we see kind of the way in which the student loan proposal has really hit a bunch of snags. The other important thing is look at how some of the Democratic candidates running this cycle are responding. And I'm thinking of John Fetterman, who, of course, is running for Senate in Pennsylvania. Remember last month when President Biden went to Pennsylvania, Fetterman was asked if he would campaign with him, and he said, yeah, I want to appear with the president because I want to talk to him about marijuana policy. That was a very specific ask. And this afternoon, after this was announced, Fetterman released a statement calling it a, quote, BFD, which we all know what that means. It's not really quite something I can say on air, but essentially saying this is a very big deal, and this was something that I asked the president to consider. So he's trying to really capitalize on that in a very close race in Pennsylvania. It gives you a sense of kind of how some people are going to try to play this. It also could open the floodgates, of course, to Republican criticism, and that's why it's important to note nobody's getting out of jail for this, but you might have some Republicans or those on the right critical of this, as crime, of course, is a huge issue in this campaign.
Right, and polls showing that race is tightening in these final weeks. I want to switch gears and talk about the other big story of the day, and that is oil and the very public disappointment that the president is now expressing over the fact that these large oil-producing nations known as OPEC Plus have decided to throttle back production in November by 2 million barrels a day, which many fear will drive up the price of oil once again. We had a chance to talk to the president briefly as he headed to Marine One this morning about that. Let's take a listen to that.
What's your reaction to the OPEC Plus decision, Mr. President?
Disappointment, and we're looking at what alternatives we may have.
Is Venezuela one of those alternatives?
There's a lot of alternatives. We haven't made up our mind yet.
So there are a lot of alternatives, Stephen. Explain what the White House did to try to lobby these OPEC nations not to take this step. Why was it unsuccessful? Why are these OPEC countries so determined to throttle back their production?
They're throttling back production because they see what all oil analysts see, which the White House sees too, which is that over the last several months, the price of oil has actually been declining in the marketplace. So they want to curb that. They want to boost the price of oil, so they're going to crimp supply.
And we should put up a graphic because we actually have something that really, displays the situation that these nations are facing. We had a high back in June of $114 a barrel. That has plummeted now to $84 a barrel.
Right, and this is the product that they're selling. So they want to see the price of a barrel of oil go back up. They're going to cut supply. You can understand the dynamic there, supply and demand. The American position has been, for months, that the American gasoline buyer, the car driver, needs some relief here. And what the White House has tried to stress for several months is that as the price of oil has come down, Americans haven't seen the similar decrease proportionately at the pump. The president sent his envoys to Saudi Arabia multiple times to try to put pressure on the OPEC countries not to do this. The president himself went to Saudi Arabia over the summer and said that he expected that the Saudis would share the urgency that the Americans were expressing. And based on the discussions that he said he had in July, he expected that further steps would be seen in the coming weeks. What did we see instead? We saw OPEC Plus cutting its supply. The president has a couple of things he can do here. He's already done most of what he can do with respect to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, ordering back in March an unprecedented release of 1 million barrels a day of America's Strategic Petroleum Reserve, a release that's scheduled to wind down at the end of this month. Yesterday, he announced he's going to put 10 million more barrels from the strategic supply into the American market. But at a certain point, we're still waiting to hear what the president's going to do next. They indicated yesterday they might still do this going forward, but there's no way to know where they're going to, how much more they can tap the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. So instead, what you had was the White House today saying again that difference between the wholesale price of oil and the retail price of gasoline needs to come together. Essentially, that amounts to a lot of finger wagging at the oil industry. This allows the president to say and use the rhetoric that he's talking to the oil companies on behalf of the American people, but ultimately this is going to be pressure for him too politically. In the last week, the price of an average gallon of gas has gone up 8.5 cents.
Right.
And that's going to have some serious impact, potentially, if the price continues to rise as the midterms near.
And let's talk about the other storyline that's bubbling underneath all of this, which is that when you talk about OPEC Plus, this isn't just the Gulf states. You're not just talking about Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Iran. You're also talking about Russia. And there's a concern that perhaps the OPEC Plus nations decided to do this to help Russia bring up its oil revenues at a very critical time for that country in its invasion of Ukraine.
The press secretary to the president said yesterday that the OPEC Plus is now aligned with Russia. on this point. And it's really starting to create a circumstance in which the question is, what is the current state of American-Saudi relations? The president today said that it indicates that there may be some problems there. And on Capitol Hill, members of both parties are starting to question the relationship that the United States has had historically with our longtime allies. Late as this summer, the president approved a rather large sale of arms to the Saudis. And you had Senator Dick Durbin, who's the majority whip in the Senate, the number 2 in the leadership there, suggesting that perhaps it's time to reevaluate the relationship.
The other question is, what else can the U.S. do? Caitlin, there was this report in the Wall Street Journal that perhaps the White House would be willing to lift some sanctions on Venezuela, another big oil-producing nation, in exchange for Chevron being able to produce more oil there. That's a very controversial move. You've already got Republicans speaking out against even the notion of doing something that would appear to be cost-setting a dictator. They don't like the idea. So what's the thinking behind this? How realistic is it?
Exactly right, Nancy. And I believe that you asked the president this as he was departing earlier today, and he essentially said options are on the table, wouldn't be specific. But it is something that even the consideration of this proposal has already invited a wave of criticism from Republicans really across the spectrum. And it really feeds into this message that they've been trying to hammer him on in terms of energy production, because they've been essentially arguing that there are things that the president could do in terms of drilling here at home, things that would take longer, of course, to affect the price of gas, but nonetheless using that as part of their argument. So you've heard of Republicans say, or at least kind of craft the argument, that here you have the president considering easing sanctions on Venezuela, a murderous dictator, instead of seeing these options here at home. And so this is going to certainly invite a lot of criticism if he does go that route, but speaks to those exact challenges that you and Steve were talking about, which there are a few options really on the table, and this is something that hits people's personal economies so closely.
No easy choices here. Caitlin Huey-Burns and Steven Portnoy, thank you so much.